Welcome back. This is the summary which data structure to use. Dealing and working with the data is the main thing that we do as a developers, and that's the reason why since the beginning of this course we have been working with JavaScript built-in data structures like arrays and objects. Then in the last few lectures we learned about a new data structure which are sets and maps, and now we have four data structures. So let's see the pros and cons of each data structure and also when to choose each of them. So I want to start this video by quickly categorizing where the data can actually come from. So there are essentially three sources of data. First, data can be written and within the program, so source code itself, like a status message that can be displayed on a web page based on our action. So second, data can come from the user interface. So from the web page, it can either be the data that the user inputs into some form, or data tests already written some in the DOM, for example, because this can be the user's task in a to-do app, or expenses in a budget app or anything like that. Finally, data can come from external sources, which is usually a web API. Now, what is a web API? Web API stands for Application Program Interface, and we can basically use a web API to get from another web applications. For example, we can use a web API to get the current weather in the city, or data about movies or currency conversion rates, and really every kind of data that you imagine, and we will learn how to work later in the course. So no matter where the data comes from and what kind of data it is, we usually have the collection of data that and then store them somewhere, and somewhere. So where do we store the collection of data? That's right, we use data structures. But as you know, there are four built-in data structures in JavaScript. So the data structures are which is simple list, arrays or sets, or the key values are pair, which is objects or maps. So as now we need a deciding between them. It is not that hard. The first station is that we just need to simply list of values. So if so, they are going to be using a array or set. But on the other hand, if we need a key value pair, they're going to need an object or map. So the big difference here is with the key value pair, and we have the way of describing the key value. So we have the way of describing the values, so by using the key. On the other hand, in a list like an array or a set, we simply have the values without any description. Okay, now now as a quick example, let's go back to the data from web API. Okay, because in modern JavaScript application, that's usually the most common source of data. So the data from web APIs usually comes in a special data format called JSON, which looks like so this is the JSON file here. Okay, so JSON is essentially just a text, so a long string. So it can easily be converted to JavaScript objects because it uses the same formatting as JavaScript objects and arrays. So here we have the three objects that describes the recipes. Here we have the values in green, and like the title as a publisher, and it makes the complete sense that the values are then described using a key. Other words, we could have no idea what the different value actually are, right? So the key value pair are essentially here. That's why the data is stored in an object, not an array. Now each of these recipes object in itself, we can see a value. Since we have many of them, it means that we have again a collection of data. Therefore we need a data structure to store them. Now, do we want to describe each of these objects? Well, it's not necessary. It is, we already know they are all recipes, and whatever information we need about recipes is actually stored right in each of the object. So all we want is basically a simple list where all of the recipes are held together. So here an array is the perfect data structure for that. In fact, creating an array of objects is extremely common in JavaScript. Okay, Now, before we move on to compare arrays and sets, objects and maps, I quickly wanted to mention that they are also the weakest sets and weakest map data structures in JavaScript. And also there are even more data structures that are used in programming, but they are not built into JavaScript. But just to mention a few, there can be stacks, queues, linked lists, trees, or hash tables. And these don't really matter for now, but I still just wanted to let you know there are more than 4 built-in data structures. Okay, but now let's talk about the built-in data structure. So you already know at this point how to use all of them, but it's important to know when to use them. So starting with the arrays versus sets, we already know that we should use them for a simple list of values. So we do not need to describe the values. Now you should use arrays whenever you need to store values in order and when these values might contain duplicates. So as you already should know, we should use arrays when you need to manipulate data because there are tons of useful array methods. Now sets on the other hand should use only when you're working with unique values. Besides that, you can also use sets in situations when high performance is really important, because operations like searching for an item or deleting an item from a set can be up to 10 times faster in sets than in arrays. Now, one more great use case for sets is to remove duplicate values from an array like we did before. So the sets are really not meant to replace arrays, but rather to complement them whenever they are dealing with the unique values. Okay. Now let's talk about objects and maps. As we already know, we should use the key value data structure when we need to describe the values using keys, right? But when to use objects and when to use maps? Well, objects have been the traditional key value data structure simply because we didn't have maps before ES6. But using objects simply as key value stores has a couple of technical disadvantages, and that's why some people say that they have been abusing objects for this. Now maps on the other hand are the way better suited for simple key value stores because they offer more performance. In fact, also maps can also have data types and they are also easy to iterate, and it's easy to compute the size of maps. However, the biggest advantage of objects is probably how easy it is to write them and access data by simply using the dot or bracket operator. Almost every developer are already super used to objects, and also they simply keep using them for simple key value stores. Anyway, as a conclusion, you should use maps when you simply need to map keys to values, and also when you need to and also when you need keys that are not strings, because we saw in the last video that can be very powerful sometimes. Now if you need some functions as values, then you should absolutely use an object for that. So in objects, these functions are then called methods, and you can use this keyboard to access properties of the same object, which is impossible in maps. And also working with JSON data, you will probably using objects for that as well, unless then you want to convert the objects to maps, but that's usually not something we do. In fact, we'll use objects all the time, but maps are also important data structure right now and way more important than sets. So let's wrap up now. Thank you.